So welcome everyone to tonight's webinar with Drake Williams called Text from the Heart, How the Emotions of the Epistles Compare to Social Media Today. My name is Jose Calvo and I'll be glad to moderate this webinar. I want to introduce to you today's speaker, Drake. Reverend Dr. Drake Williams serves as Associate Professor of New Testament at Evangelische Theologische Faculteit in Leuven, Belgium. I probably didn't get that right.
That's not bad.
But I hope you will forgive me. He has written or been involved in editing 6 books. He and his wife are active in mission work with the European Christian Mission from North America. And he has also taught on the mission field at Tyndale Theological Seminary in Bad Hoeverdorp, the Netherlands. Is that right?
Bad Hoeverdorp. That's pretty good.
Okay. Also he has also taught in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and in Romania at Colegiul Biblic Est European and the Baptist Institute at the Bucharest State University. And Drake serves as the Minister of Mission and Theology at the Central Schwenkfelder Church in Worcester. Drake and his wife, Andrea, reside in North Wales, Pennsylvania, and well, it was a lot of difficult names, but I think we made it. So yes, Drake, welcome. I'm very glad that we can have you here today with us and that you can be sharing about the topic of the epistles compared to social media today. So Drake, please take the mic now.
Okay, very good. And good evening to those in Europe. Good afternoon to those in North America. It's a pleasure to be back here serving with the Forum of Christian Leaders, and a pleasure to be able to connect again with Jose. I think we've done this several times before, so thank you, Jose, for administering this while we talk tonight about sections of the New Testament and then comparing it with the way that we think as a result of modern technology. I want to share with you a little bit as to how this topic came to mind. I'm a Pauline scholar, and I work some in early Christianity. Particularly, my interests are in the Corinthian letters, as well as the letter to the Romans, but I've done other things in other parts of Paul's letters. And I've been thinking about just the way that we read letters. Many don't understand the way that ancient communication was done with through the writing of letters. It seems in our day and age that very few people write handwritten letters one to each other. My wife and I were calling the other day. We're closing in on 30 years worth of marriage, all happy years. But we used to write to each other letters. Handwritten letters, and particularly while engaged. I think I wrote to my wife, who was, well, my fiance at that time, who was several time zones away from me. I was writing her a letter each day. My kids sort of gasped at that I would actually have the time to write out on a sheet of paper or several sheets of paper what is happening each day. Kids don't do that anymore, as we know that from seeing our children. It's rare for them to write a letter, much more likely for them to write an email. And of course, now we're in the time of text messaging. I'm on the faculty at the Evangelische Theologische Fakulteit in Leuven, and just this last year at the Institute there, the Institute of Leadership and Social Ethics, those running the Institute wanted to deal with this topic of moral discernment in an age of complex technology. So I was thinking about that, and I thought, considering the ways that we can communicate now and the ways in which people used to communicate, this might be an interesting comparison for us at the conference. So this presentation tonight is not as technical as the one that I gave in Leuven in February, but hopefully discernible. And I hope that it'll be stimulating for you as you think of the way that you communicate, whether through text message or email or other means, and also be help for you as you think about reading ancient communication from the Bible, particularly that of the letters of the New Testament? Well, we should evaluate technology. I mean, technology is a wonderful thing. It does lots of things that can make us ooh and ah, and also speed along life. But we've always had a calling to examine the technology that we're using and the way that affects the way that we think. Way back in 1964, Marshall McLuhan wrote in Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, he wrote this famous quote that I think many of you will know: "The medium is the message." The medium is the message. Not there is a message, and not that there is a medium, but the medium, certainly in the very least, affects the way that we communicate. At that time, he was talking about movies. That's 1964. Boy, have we come a long way since that. But the calling to evaluate technology and the way that we communicate has gone on at least since 1964. Perhaps you're familiar with the Jewish sociologist named Neil Postman, who writes in this book, Technopoly. Technopoly, not technology, but technopoly, how technology has monopolized the way that we think. And he gives us this quote in his book, Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. He writes, "Technology can destroy the vital sources of humanity. It creates a culture without moral foundation and reorders our fundamental assumptions about the world at large. The uncontrolled growth of technology destroys the vital sources of our humanity." Now, he was writing that in 1993, just a little bit after the invention of the internet. So he's saying this in 1993, and of course, technology has progressed quite a bit since then. And there's another book that gives us a further calling to, once again, evaluate the technology that we use. This is from Sherry Turkle, who I'm going to highlight a little bit in the coming slides. But she writes in the book, The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit. She writes this: "Technology catalyzes changes not only in what we do, but in how we think. It offers the illusion of companionship." And Sherry Turkle's book, The Second Self, has gone on to a second printing as it has stimulated people to think about the way that technology has shaped the way that we think about life today. So here's what I'm trying to do in this presentation. I like to evaluate one aspect of modern communication. And there are all sorts of routes that we could go with this, but we're only going to take on one tonight, and that is the text message. And we're going to look at the text message in relation to emotion. How does the text message affect the way that we express emotion? We'll try and analyze that. And then we're going to compare it with an examination in ancient correspondence from about 2,000 years ago, that being the Corinthian letters. And we will look at those letters and compare emotions, and then compare the way that text messaging is affecting emotions in light of ancient correspondence. And then we're going to try and set forward some reasons as to why ancient correspondence can carry the weight, can carry the freight, should we say, of emotional correspondence by just reflecting on how ancient correspondence was done and how it differs today from sending a text message. So let's talk about text messages. My guess is that all of you text message in one way or another, or at least you are familiar with it. We're going to try and give some parameters of it. And I should first say that text messaging is valuable for what it is. There are many things that make text messaging very helpful. I serve in the pastorate, and it's very helpful, let's say, when one leaves the hospital after visiting a parishioner, and then being able to walk outside of the hospital and very briefly send a message to the secretary at the church and say, "I'm leaving the hospital now. I'm going on to the next visit." It's very helpful for that, and it certainly does speed things along. But there are drawbacks from text messages that we ought to look at for some time. Let's start with some statistics of text messages. There are over 5.035 billion texters in the world today. That's a lot of people who are working with text messages. And approximately 277 million texters in the United States, not including children 12 years old and younger. Of course, there are some children who are on text messages even from the age of 12 years, but they're not included, at least in that stat. At least 97% of smartphone owners text regularly. If you own a smartphone, then almost for certain are you texting to a variety of people. There are obvious benefits. Data is communicated quickly to people at a distance, and they could be just around the corner. They could be across the district, across a province, across even through different countries, and it can be very helpful to send a text message. Usually the average text message is about 7 words in length, and these little blips, these maybe 2 lines, as you can see in the picture, go back and forth between people. They can be done rather rapidly as data is shared from one to another. Are there emotions in text messages? Certainly. You can see it, at least when somebody sends you a text message in all capital letters. That might give you the idea, oh, they're shouting at you. Maybe they're angry with you, but they're expressing the emotion of at least a volume, anger or frustration by using all capital letters. If somebody texts you and uses an asterisk before or after a word, or an exclamation point before or afterwards, it can also lead to drawing attention to something, maybe a particular word, maybe a warning, but that's a way that some people use emotions in text messages. What's becoming more frequent, though, is the use of emojis. Emojis, little smiley faces or faces with hearts in them or tears, and these too can be sent by text message, and it's a very brief and succinct way of trying to communicate some emotion. So, do text messages have emotions? They certainly do. How much emotion do text messages have? Well, that's another story. Emojis are interesting. So I did a little work on emojis and came across a study from the University of Michigan as well as Peking University in China, which analyzed 427 messages from nearly 4 million smartphone users in 212 countries and regions to see if the emoji use was universal or different based on user location and culture. By far and away, the emoji that was used the most was that of somebody smiling and also sort of crying at the same time. Then the second most frequent, that of the heart expressing love. The third one, somebody with 2 hearts in their eyes indicating maybe that they are in love now or they're feeling some infatuation. Then after that, a kiss or somebody blowing a kiss, showing love or affection. Then a smile. Then anyway, you can see all the more popular emojis that are used. There are plenty of emojis. Some emojis are very rarely used, but these are the 20 most popular emojis that are used around the world. Interesting to see which countries use which emojis. If you're French, you'll see that the #1 emoji is actually a heart, while most of the other countries has somebody smiling with the tears coming from their eyes. But usually in the top 3 is that of love or somebody being in love. Now and then there's, if you're in Brazil, the 4th one in is an applause. Interesting to see the ways that these different countries express different emotions. I found it a little interesting to see where the heart was for a few countries. Turkey, the heart is about 8th there on the list. Indonesia, it's about 10th on the list. I don't know if this says something about individual cultures, probably does to an extent, but I wasn't able to explore it much further than that. Different countries expressing different emotions through these different emojis. But I'm left with some questions about emotions in emojis. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, and of course that was said long before there was anything like an emoji, is an emoji worth 1,000 words? I don't know. Be interested in your thoughts on emojis, particularly if you're an emoji user. The emoji, of course, is brief, it's simplified, and it's certainly comical. And looking at the third line down and third in from the right, where you have the guy who's got all teeth out there. I mean, that's certainly comical. It does communicate things, but that's a comical way of expressing an emotion, unlike, let's say, maybe happiness or sadness, which maybe the top line provides us with the smiley face and then somebody who's crying. A question is, if emojis replace words, the more that they define which the ideas that can be, can they limit the way that we express ourselves? I think that's an interesting question some people are looking at. Does an emoji affect the way that we communicate a particular emotion one way or another? Certainly, sometimes when people are texting back and forth and using emojis, they can carry loaded messages in the use of an emoji. Where somebody could be really, really sad and express tears coming out of the eyes through the emoji, or they might be just a little bit sad and have reached for a sad icon, but not heartbroken. Has the emoji limited or enhanced the way that emotion is expressed? There are drawbacks to emotions when it is only expressed just slightly by the use of a picture, and a comical picture at that. Now, let's take a look at, shift our focus slightly and think about emotions and side effects in text messages. Emotions can be found in text messages, but there might be side effects that are taking place as text messages are being used. And now I'm going to refer to some surprising results from a study completed by Dr. Sherry TURKLE. I mentioned her a little bit earlier. Sherry TURKLE is a professor at MIT, sociologist there at MIT, and she's been there for many years, and she's worked on this idea of technology and emotion for the last 30 years. And she's written a book at the beginning of this last decade called Alone Together. And I'll show you a picture of the book in a moment. This is one of the most memorable quotes of that book. We expect more from technology and less from each other. We create technology to provide the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. That's an interesting quote. We're creating technology and we're getting the sense from it that we're connected with people, but really she's finding that it's rather an illusion. Here's her book, Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. She, in this book, explores robotics and then goes on to speak about social media. Social media in particular is what pertains to this discussion tonight, where the modern age is connecting us readily through technology, whether it be through Twitter, whether it be through Facebook, whether it be through Snapchat, whether it be through Instagram. And we can have the feeling that we are connected to each other, but instead it's actually producing an unwelcome number of side effects, which she identifies, and I wish to share with you some of the findings of these side effects from social media. One is loneliness. She starts with a study that reports that nearly half of, at least an American report done on loneliness, reports that half of Americans report sometimes or always people are always feeling alone, about a half of Americans. 1 in 4 rarely or never feels as though there are people who really understand them. And only half of Americans have meaningful in-person social interactions. Now, that may or may not have anything directly to deal with text messaging and social media, but the surprising finding in her study is this: at ages 18 through 22, she finds to be the loneliest generation. Now that's interesting because the age group 18 through 22 is also the most connected generation through various means of social media. So in her study, she finds that loneliness is highest among the most connected generation. Surprising side effect from social media. Also in her study, she notes that lesser emotional depth is found in conversation. And she does a study of several emotions, but particularly the emotion of empathy. And in her examination of empathy, she finds that empathy within society has dropped 40%. But in the last 10 years, this emotion of empathy has dropped especially. And she notes that self-reflection and intimacy has become lower. Also a problem with technology is the sense of disruption, whether it be with a smartphone where text messages are going back and forth, or whether it simply be a phone that is available. It can distract and also prevent and inhibit conversation between people. If you're communicating by smartphone, you may bypass a facial expression that can be so important in a relationship with one and another. If you're communicating by text, you don't catch the tone as frequently. And the pause that takes place in a conversation of value is oftentimes ignored. Emotions, she finds, can be underdeveloped from the use of signs such as a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Does that really develop or allow for the expression of complex emotions? Do emojis allow for the complex emotions like admiration or compassion, positive emotions? Can you really express that through the signs of a thumbs up or a thumbs down or an emoji? Even negative emotions can be affected, she says. I mean, even the emotion of boredom, which she finds so many who are young are trying to avoid. Boredom has difficulty of being seen of any value. Or Sherry Turkle would encourage us that boredom becomes a place by which one can readjust one's thoughts and one's inner being so that one can move on to the next thing in life. Certainly, the presence of cell phones and smartphones makes conversation shallower. On average, many in the Western world look at their cell phones once every 6 minutes. That's a lot. And if you're in a conversation with somebody and you're looking at the phone once every 6 minutes, it prevents a depth of conversation from taking place. And then finally, multitasking prevents depth of expression and a lack of attention in this world as well. So disruption, a major side effect from social media, particularly text messages. There's more I could say from Sherry Turkle's work, but I'll leave you with one quotation from her book, Alone Together. All matters, some delicate, some not, are crammed into a medium that quickly communicates a state, but is not well suited for opening a dialogue about complexity of feeling. Texting interrupted by bad reception, incoming calls, and other text messages can compromise the intimacy it promises. And then she quotes an 18-year-old boy. There is a difference between someone laughing and someone writing that they are laughing. My friends are so used to giving their phone all the attention, they forget that people are still there to give attention to. One pointed quote from her book, of which there are many, many others. Now, we've talked about text messaging for a little bit, and I'm sure you have some thoughts and comments, which I would be very interested in your perceptions on emotions in text messages. But now let's try and compare it with Paul's letters. Now we're dialing back the clock about 2,000 years, and I wish to compare the way that emotions were communicated in the first century with how they are being communicated in the 21st century. Corinthian correspondence is particularly interesting for us because it's a conversation that is going on between Paul, a church that he was very involved with. In fact, he founded this church, and a dialogue that is taking place for at least 6 years. Now, evangelical scholars will tell you that there are at least 4 letters written by Paul to the church in Corinth, and that makes it unique for this consideration, and that so many other letters in the New Testament are maybe just a one-off letter or a letter to a particular person. But this is a correspondence that's that's going on between Paul and a group of people. And we're going to find that there's quite a bit of emotion going on in these 2 letters that have been preserved for us out of 4. What's happening between Paul and the Corinthians? This is what the history is. Paul visits, founds the church in AD 50. He then writes his first letter, which is lost, unfortunately, in AD 53. Delegates from Corinth bring reports to him, as well as a letter to Paul in Ephesus. And then Paul writes what we consider to be 1 Corinthians. It's at least his second letter to the Corinthians, but it's the first one that we have preserved, 1 Corinthians. Then Paul makes a painful visit to the Corinthians about AD 55, and then he writes what is considered the tearful letter. And there have been a variety of opinions as to what that letter is or where it is, but it's, in my opinion, we don't have it. It's the intermediary between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And then finally, in AD 56, he writes 2 Corinthians to the congregation in Corinth. So we've got at least 2 letters that tell us Paul's dealing with the Corinthians. And then we have 2 other letters that we can infer from 1st and 2nd Corinthians that also tell us there's a conversation that's going on between Paul and Corinth. Let's now take a look at some examples of emotion in 1 Corinthians. There is strong emotion in 1 Corinthians with strong exhortations. I've given you a list of several places where there are strong exhortations, strong commands, particularly with the use of the word parakaleo. And here's the first one in the letter. I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no division among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. One of a number of strong exhortations within the letter. There's another emotion that shows up shortly after 1 Corinthians 1:10, and that's that of jealousy and strife. 1 Corinthians 1:11, then also 3:3 and 4. I'm just reading from chapter 3 here. For you are still of the flesh, for while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? Paul has identified a strong emotion, that being jealousy as well as strife taking place at Corinth. How about another strong emotion? This one being a strong one of warning, which shows up several places in 1 Corinthians. You are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. That's a strong warning, delivering someone to Satan, and for the destruction of the flesh. Once again, strong emotion, a warning of destruction. He pleads with the Corinthians. Here's one of them, 1 Corinthians 4:15 through 16. For though you have countless guides in Christ, meaning countless leaders who would be in your midst, you do not have many fathers. Of course, that would be Paul, the founder of the church in Corinth. For I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel. I urge you then, there's the pleading, then be imitators of me. Go on, here's another threat. This one quite obvious. What do you wish, as he speaks to the Corinthians, Shall I come to you with a rod, or with love in a spirit of gentleness? Another strong emotion, that of arrogance, boasting, and shame. You're talking about a man caught in incest, where very strong emotions come out in Paul's writing. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant. There's the emotion. Ought you not rather to mourn? Another strong emotion. Let him who has done this be removed from among you. How about a declaration of the Lord's jealousy? We've already seen jealousy in the middle of the Corinthian congregation. How about the Lord's jealousy? Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? 1 Corinthians 10:22. We've been speaking about some negative emotions. How about a positive one? Now I commend you. It's a commendation, something positive. Commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. Now, other strong emotions in the Corinthian letters show up in several places. Here's one where someone becomes undone and might fall on their face by emotion. 1 Corinthians 14:23-25. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders or believers enter, will they not say that you are out of your minds? If all prophecy and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, there's the emotion, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. Well, we can go on, and I'm not going to take this much further. There's inferiority, there's confusion, there's peace, there's hope. These are all emotions. Let me do highlight a special strong emotions. Mocking, 1 Corinthians 4:8. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us you have become kings. And would that you did reign so that we might share the rule with you. Mocking. It's also sarcastic. Already you have all you want. Well, of course, Paul realizes they don't really have the true wealth that they really need. And there's a self-directed woe. A condemnation against himself if Paul doesn't follow through on something. And that's found in 1 Corinthians 9:16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Woe to me, the emotion there. It's hard to speak about 1 Corinthians and not speak of some of the greatest emotional description of love, which is found in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. I'm sure you're familiar with this section. It's still read today because it's such a classic expression of emotion. And we read it at weddings or in other places too in the life of the church. 1 Corinthians 13 will then conclude with, in faith, hope, and love abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. Lots of emotion in 1 Corinthians. While many think of it as a letter written to correct the Corinthians, Paul does not give us a laundry list of things that should and should not be done. He fills his argumentation with emotion. Well, that's just only one of two letters that we have preserved from Paul's Corinthian correspondence. 2 Corinthians is probably one of the most, if not the most, emotional letter that we have in the New Testament. It goes up and down and back and forth, and as we read some of these texts now, 2 Corinthians, I'm sure you'll hear some of the emotion in some of these passages, such as comfort and affliction in 2 Corinthians 1:3-7. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. And if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort. A lovely section where Paul encourages the Corinthians in their trials, or in the trials that he has too, that God is using the comfort that he builds into the lives of suffering believers to be a blessing to many others. Paul will go on and speak through his letter about a near-death experience, 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10. For we don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. You can hear the emotion pouring from the pen as he writes. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Such a strong emotion there. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope, that he will deliver us again. Here, just in the very first chapter, comfort, affliction, sentence of death, deadly peril, deliverance. Paul is just really getting started on a very, very emotional letter. Sometimes Paul in 2 Corinthians will redefine an emotion, such as boasting, where he will say what is a proper way to boast, what's an improper way to boast. This will eventually culminate in 2 Corinthians 11 and 12, where he has these words about boasting. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. See how he's taking boasting and redefining it, reproportioning it. And then he will talk about his great boasting, even in great pain. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Well, great section of Paul's writing where he redefines what is true, what true boasting should be in. Other emotion in 2 Corinthians, he speaks about the painful visit where he came to Corinth, and as it says, verse 4 here, he wrote out of much affliction and anguish of heart, with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. And then in verse 5, if I've caused anybody pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure has done so to them. Well, we could go on. We won't read all these sections of 2 Corinthians, but just listing some of the emotions that can be found in the letter. Commending and confidence, a work of joy, a work of perseverance, a work of courage, ministering in the fear of the Lord, another emotion, sorrow, forgiveness, weariness, groaning, uncertainty. And you can see it goes on and on. So I give you even a little picture here to see how varied his emotions are. Grief, earnestness, rejoicing, joy, affection, humiliation, cheerfulness. It goes back and forth, up and down, from high to low. And then discussions about meekness, humility, fear, jealousy, foolishness, shame, as well as conceit. He will even use emotion to appeal, not just reflect how he is, but even appeal to the Corinthians. Here's one out of 2 Corinthians 7. Make room in your hearts for us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have taken advantage of no one. I do not say this to condemn you, for I said before that you are in our hearts, to die together and to live together. I am acting with great boldness towards you. I have great pride in you. I am filled with comfort in all our affliction, I am overflowing with joy. It's appealing to an openness. Open wide your heart. Not just listing of facts or appealing to a resume, but opening, urging them to open their hearts. It's an emotional appeal. Later in 2 Corinthians 12, he will go on to assume that the Corinthians would understand the ecstasy of being caught up into the heavens, as he writes of his experience there in the heavenly places. So you can see that the Corinthian letters are very emotional. They display also a wide range of emotions, from, should we say, happy to sad, but then also a complexity of emotions, boasting, shame, earnestness, jealousy, tenderness, and then especially true love. It is not just Paul to one person, but he's communicating these emotions publicly to an entire body of believers, likely 120 or so at 1 Corinthians, maybe even up to 200 by the time we reach 2 Corinthians. Okay, so now we have text messages. 7 word on average message going between two people, sometimes at a great distance, with emojis, in comparison to this elaborate correspondence that's taking place between Paul and the Corinthians, where we were reaching a whole wide array of emotions, very much in depth in some places. What's the difference now between communication, ancient and modern? We've seen, obviously, a very great difference between text message and ancient letter. Let's refresh our understanding on, or explore, as the case might be, how Paul would have written in the first century. Let's just, look at writing in the first century for a few minutes. There was a great value in writing. Writing materials were expensive, and when somebody took a pen to papyrus in the time of the first century, it was usually considered to be valuable by placing something on papyrus. Not everything turned out to be valuable, but at least it was viewed so in the mind of the author. Writing could be recognized to be powerful. In fact, we even see a reflection of that in 2 Corinthians 10:10. For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. So the reception of a letter could certainly carry a lot of strength in the ancient world. The way in which Paul wrote would have taken some time. It was a lengthy and a thoughtful process that Paul used. He wrote carefully. He likely would begin by writing on a wax tablet, like the picture I've given you in the upper right-hand corner. He may have stopped along the way, thought about things, and then continued later. This might have led to some of the breaks that we now see, at least train of thought-wise, in the letters that he's written. As he went along, he may have added material, then stopped, then added material, then stopped again. Very different from at least the way the modern text message is written, usually thumbs very hurriedly and sending it off to somebody. Paul wrote and he interacted with people as he wrote. Sometimes he had co-authors, like in 1 Corinthians. It's Paul, but it's also Paul and Sosthenes who write. It's not that Sosthenes is an equal contributor, but he's listed in 1 Corinthians 1:1 as writing with Paul. More frequently, it's Timothy who writes alongside of Paul. Philippians 1:1, Colossians 1:1, or Philemon 1. Paul frequently had a scribe or an amanuensis. Maybe you've heard that word, amanuensis, just a scribe who recorded Paul's letters. Tertius is listed as the scribe in Romans 16, verse 22. Galatians doesn't have a scribe, but it assumes that there's a scribe, at least as we get to the end of the letters when Paul says, I write these letters with my own hand and a large hand. So it implies that the rest of the letter was written by somebody else. While others may have contributed as a scribe or as a co-author, it should always be considered the lead author in ancient times as being the author of the epistle. But my point is here is that Paul was not doing this just by himself, but there were others alongside him. Another factor in Paul's writings is that he frequently included scripture. He quotes from what we know to be the Old Testament frequently, maybe 10 to 12% of the time in his letters. And sometimes it's most interesting the way he expresses himself, like 1 Corinthians 4:6, that you may learn not to go beyond the things which are written, meaning the scriptures. The scriptures were of such value, and Paul quotes these and took careful attention to the contents of that as he developed his letters, whether it be to the Corinthians or whether it be to individuals. The value of what was quoted would have been considered high, and that's also a characteristic of Paul's letters. His letters were also read aloud. Ancient society read letters aloud to each other. Vast difference from the way that we communicate today. Very rarely would we read a text message or even an email aloud, but they read letters aloud to each other frequently in the ancient world. Scripture and letters were read widely. I mean, we can sense that from even the Corinthian correspondence, 1 Corinthians 5:9 and 2 Corinthians 2. And then Paul will say it this way in 2 Corinthians 1:13. For we are not writing to you anything other than what you read. Interesting, that's read, you plural. And it's not as if every person could read, but every person could listen while the letter was read aloud. For we are not writing to you anything other than what you read, and understand, and I hope you will fully understand 2 Corinthians 1:13. The difference between ancient letters and our letters today, or text messages, is that the letters were collected, and we have early understanding that letters were collected and circulated within the early church. Here's just part of the Moratorian canon. It most likely dates from 180 AD. It's a fragment, but it gives us a listing of books, and it gives us a listing of Paul's epistles, as if they were all traveling together by the time of maybe just 120, 130 years after his death. Marcion, who was the earliest heretic in the life of the church, he even recognized that there were a collection of Paul's letters that were circulating. Marcion created his own New Testament, should we say, and had the Gospel of Luke in it, but then also Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, which he called the letter to the Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. So if we're working with Marcion as a collector, even if he wasn't a good collector, he was still collecting some of Paul's letters from the middle of the 2nd century. The Chester Beatty Papyrus provides the earliest collection of Paul's letters. We have it dated to about 200 AD. It's housed in Dublin, Ireland, at a special library, the Chester Beatty Library, and it contains most of the Pauline epistles, as well as the epistle to the Hebrews. So here now, from just 130, 140 years afterwards, we have actually tangible evidence in our hands that Paul's letters were being grouped together, and we see this in the Chester Beatty Papyrus. So very different from modern text messages. Paul's letters took more time to write. They contained quotations from Scripture, which were to be handled with care, and they were read aloud in a community. Their value was seen in the fact that also that they were collected from early time. Well, perhaps that can account for the difference in emotion between text messages as well as Paul's ancient communication. Let's now try and close with some evaluation. Text messages can be very valuable in communicating data, but competence and efficiency, which is a hallmark of text messages, likely causes more problems with emotions. Writing is not the problem with emotions, because we can see ancient correspondence like the Corinthian letters, which contain a great deal of emotion within them. But short data communications based on competence and efficiency likely cannot carry the same emotional freight as ancient correspondence. And as a result, an evaluation that I would like to put forward with text messages is that they're helpful with data, but they might be very harmful with regards to emotion. Back to Sherry Turkle's work, who analyzed some of the side effects from modern communication through social media, has written another book that has just come out within the last year and a half or so, and it's called Reclaiming Conversation: The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. And she is encouraging us to try and reverse the trends of social media by disconnecting from it in order to connect, at least in order to connect emotionally. Put the phone down when you're at a dining table where there are other people. Put the phone away when your long-lost friend comes in from out of town, and engage them eye to eye, looking at their face, paying attention to tone, paying attention to pause in conversation. Disconnect from the modern social media so that you can reconnect with someone emotionally. I think her point is a very good one. But then I have one other one to add as we bring this presentation to conclusion. If we're interested in reading the ancient letters, I think we need to be aware of how modern communication has moved us along too rapidly, so that we do not see the depth of emotion being expressed in ancient communication. We need to slow down and explore the discussion much more broadly. What were the events happening in the lives of the author, happening in the lives of the church, happening in the lives of the broader church at that time? Slow down, explore the discussion more broadly, so that we can better understand what is being written down on the preserved text in front of us, and then ultimately understand better in our hearts the message that Paul, and for that matter, other New Testament letter writers are trying to communicate. Well, thank you for listening to this presentation. I look forward very much to your thoughts and your comments about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Drake. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we can have some time for a Q&A. So if any one of you have any questions, any thoughts, any discussion, please, you can just either turn your mic on and just ask directly the question, or you can write it down and I will read it out loud. So feel free just right now. Julie writes, "Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It is interesting."
Thank you, Julie.
I think we cannot identify with what you were talking about, the connection and disconnection that our social media and telephones can mean for today. Okay, first question: how can we objectively know the emotions from the epistles? Example: my parents do not understand emoticons. I do, because it is from my time.
Okay, which do we want to take first here? Should we take epistles first and then move on to emoticons? That's the way I'm going to do it. I think sometimes, I mean, having taught the letters for a number of years, I think some people come to the letters in the New Testament and think, oh, maybe this is a list of commands or a list of directions. But we can look at these and just look for emotional ideas that are found within them. And that's what I was trying to do by just highlighting jealousy or boasting or commendation or suffering. if you look for the emotions, you'll see them much more readily than if we just assuming that this is a list of commands or directions. As far as emoticons or emojis, that might be a really interesting cross-generational discussion. I'm on my smartphone with my kids periodically, and they're repeatedly putting emojis, emoticons into their messages, and I just can't keep up with them. Maybe it's something that's known from one person to another. But I'll be interested in your thoughts, Julie. I mean, let's just take maybe one or two of the most common ones. What do you mean by, if you were to send somebody? Let's take the most common one.
Can you hear me?
Coming from their eyes. What do you mean by that?
Can you hear me? I think so.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I think my question is because in the text there's all the context, and you have to understand the context of the text in order to identify what are their emotions, what does it mean. So if I send an emoticon to my mother, she will send me something that makes no sense. And if you're from my generation, you will know that. So I'm thinking, how can we objectively know that we're interpreting the text correctly and the emotions correctly? If I look into comparison with my mom, for example, that she doesn't understand because she's not from that time. That's what I hope. I don't know if you get it.
Well, let me come back to you, and then you can respond too. I mean, so your mom is sending you emoticons as well?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but do you have a common understanding of what the emoticon means?
She doesn't, because she used them wrong. There's the codes, and you can't send a like the one with the teeth. That means you did something wrong. It doesn't mean you're smiling. So she will send it wrong. So that's what I mean. Sometimes we're looking at the text of Paul and we probably think, okay, I'm interpreting this right, but maybe that's not what it meant.
Yeah. Well, I guess that brings up a whole bunch of questions. I mean, if one's communicating with a family member, I guess you can come to some certain understanding. But if you're sending an emoticon or emoji to somebody that you're less familiar with, it's possible you might not be communicating the emotion.
So
or you might mean different emotions, right?
Yes. So how can we know if we're interpreting the text of what Paul really meant? Because we're looking with our 21st century understanding of emotions, of codes, and Paul is writing to a certain time, to certain people, and the whole context. We don't have two of his letters, so we don't probably know what he means.
Right. Okay. Well, if you're going that direction, yeah. Well, we can understand at least some of it, right?
Okay. Yes.
We can at least, just with emotions, we can look for emotional language. Comfort, boasting, hope, love, those are emotional words.
Okay.
And that's a starting point.
Okay.
Happening with the context in Corinth, or the what's happening in Paul's life could give extra emotion to it. But we have to slow down the discussion enough to be able to pick up the emotion, moving on through it, which I think the rapidity of modern technology encourages us to do.
Okay. That makes more sense.
That's just a starting point. But I mean, what do you think?
Excuse me?
I said that's just a starting point, but what do you think?
I think sometimes it's hard for us to understand the codes of the time, and sometimes what is boasting, for example, for Paul? What does boasting probably mean for his readers? What was the context? What probably he was referring to something else that we lost in one of the letters. Yeah. So I think sometimes it's difficult to interpret. While for me, when I'm texting, I understand because I have the whole context. Yeah. And even so, it's hard.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But I guess your comment does bring up the issue of if you know the background of the person with whom you're communicating, and you yourself know what you're communicating, it's easier.
Yes, yes.
Which I think we're trying to explore. Let's say if we're looking at Paul and the Corinthians, what do we know about Paul? What do we know about the Corinthians? And how can that help us understand the discussion better?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. There are any more questions? Please just feel free to jump in.
Maybe I could throw a question to everybody who's listening out here, if that's fair.
Yes, feel free.
How frequently do you text message? How frequently do you use emojis? There are certain emojis that you use more frequently than others? I'd just be curious.
Every day, the whole day.
It's great to run away from an issue. Okay. You want to spell that out a little bit more, Julie? Or
if somebody texts me something that I don't want to express my real feelings, I'll send them a weird smile.
okay.
And if they're really sensitive to emoticon, they will understand that I'm dropping the subject.
Okay.
Or I will send a thumbs up. Thumbs up means okay, whatever.
Okay. All right.
There is one question from one registrant from the registration. Would we have had the epistles today if Paul and the apostles had a more direct way of communicating, like SMS or texting?
That's a good question. We gave this presentation at in Leuven back in February. Some said, "Would Paul have used an SMS?" I mean, it's sort of hard to know. I mean, it's reading history backwards to some degree. Would we have had the epistles? I don't know if this. My supposition is the conclusion that I'm coming to today is that certain things could not have been communicated via SMS at that time. Would he have used a data communication if he was going from one house in the Agora to another house? Maybe, but could he have written the type of complex argument of 1st and 2nd Corinthians by text message? I don't think so. I just don't think that would have carried the freight that he needed it to carry. Of course, we'll never know because these technological developments took place later on, but I just don't think that it could carry the same way. It's Julie, I appreciate that. He could, but he needed to be younger. Okay.
Just some 2,000 years.
2,000 years.
But I think you make a great point that there are things that we can express and we can use technology for many great things in communications, but at the same time, there are things that you cannot just express in a text message. You need to either see face to face or write something longer to be able to express yourself properly or express the depth of your emotions.
Love is patient. Love is kind. Can we really have used an SMS to communicate that? I don't think that's...
Just one question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Regarding that, but if it was like an email, a longer email, I think is that okay? Because I think that if you send a longer email, you can probably express more, just in comparison.
Okay. Well,
because SMS is small, but a long email, you probably...
You could. We haven't really evaluated emails and their ability to hold emotion.
Oh, okay. Okay. Just to
but
clarify.
I'm talking about that. I think that's interesting. I have some friends that say they don't read long emails. They're looking for maybe a paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences, largely for data.
Okay.
Yeah. But could you? Yeah, could is different than should, or what is most advantageous.
Robert comments, I think that we are losing a lot today. Paper is much better than electronic. Thankful that Paul was not using texting.
Good point. I mean, let's say Paul was a texter, just for argument's sake. At least the first century mode of communication was more thoughtful, slower, writing on a wax tablet, writing through a scribe. I don't think that fits the same text messaging operanda or mode that we are today, where usually you get a 7-word text, and then all of a sudden you're quickly sending it back. The communication is quicker right now. And some of the things that Paul communicated definitely took a length of time to think, how am I going to express this? How am I going to turn a phrase, use a scripture text to get my point across?
Julie also comments to that. It is a good point, Professor, that writing is slower and well thought. Many mistakes can be made with WhatsApping and Snapchat because it is fast and without thinking much.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good exercise for us in our texting and messaging online, to maybe slow it a little bit to make sure that we're saying what we want to say and not make some mistakes.
Yes.
I was thinking about Paul. He was not mad, but upset with some people. If he had texting, things could have gone so wrong. He would just have texted his first emotion.
You think he would use all caps?
Oh, full caps, very long, just like that very annoying text. Probably would be like 300 words. He probably tweeted or something. So it's good that he thought, because even thinking, he was a little bit harsh. So imagine if you really could do it instantly.
But data communication, I don't think is a problem with text messaging. I'm going to be home at 5:30 tonight, dear, instead of 5:15. Okay, I mean, it's helpful to get the data out there quickly. But at least if I'm thinking about expressing things to a loved one like my wife, it's nice to be able to have a little bit of time to think, how am I gonna share this? How am I gonna say something?
I'm from I still had phones when those old phones when I was growing up, but if I look into newer generations, that's how they express themselves. And I'm wondering if that's the only language they know, and that's the only language they will communicate. So if doing the contrary, would that be effective? Will they understand somebody calling them? For example, my phone only rings if it's the doctor. Mm-hmm. People usually don't call me. Even if something happens bad, they will text me. Mm-hmm. And I just got used to that. So I wonder if our next generation will know what that means, to go talk to somebody, sit down and have quality time, or will they only communicate through messages?
There are certain things that I just don't feel like I would want to communicate via text message. An example, I lost my mother in the fall of 2017. I made sure that I called who was in Chicago at the time. I could have sent him a text, but I needed to talk to him over the phone and communicate that. Maybe other situations that demand a phone call, and maybe from some of us who have have communicated by mail or phone or even dropping everything and going over to somebody's house and saying, "I just heard about this. I just want you to know how very sorry I am that you've lost somebody," and looking them in the eye. Maybe at least the coming generation needs to know that that's a possibility.
I guess that's true. I think I totally agree with that. It's definitely something that should be taught, but it's hard if their parents are also only on the phone. If you see a mom with their kid now, they're usually on the phone. So the parents are not, they're not teaching their kids that. So I find it hard that their kids will learn how to do that.
Going back to Sherry Turkle's work, which I find is very interesting, at the end of both of her books, I think both of the books that I've highlighted, Reclaiming Conversation and then Alone Together, she talks about her relationship with her daughter and how she's particularly trying to continue to develop face-to-face time and talking time over the phone. And I'm reading a little bit between the lines that you can't do that with everybody. We're all limited by some things, by time and space, time zone. But we can do that with some, and it's worth exploring that, at least with some.
Yeah. So I think that probably usually when we talk about social media, we address youth. Probably the good idea would be to address adults and not the youth.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's where the example first starts, isn't it? Remember coaching sports, and I had a boy out on the baseball field in the Netherlands, and but his father wasn't paying attention. Why? Because he was off to the side on his cell phone. Maybe it does need to go to the adults first.
True. Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's good thoughts, Julie. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the discussion. And I think with this, we can come to an end for today's webinar as the time is up. So thank you, everyone, for the discussion, for the questions. Thank you, Drake, for taking the time to prepare and to prepare and to present this material on the epistles and on the emotions. And thank you very much from all of us. Have a nice rest of the day or rest of the evening, wherever you find yourselves, and God bless you.
Thank you, Jose, for all your help tonight too. Always blessing on you as well. Okay.